Georgia Republicans delivered two of the biggest verdicts of the 2026 campaign season. Welcome to a special edition of the Politically Georgia podcast from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. I'm Greg Bluestein here in Sandy Springs with Tia Mitchell and Patricia Murphy, both on the campaign trail in Jackson. Hey, guys.
Hey, Greg.
Hello, we're here.
In the race for governor, billionaire Rick Jackson defeated Lieutenant Governor Burt Jones despite endorsements from both Donald Trump and Brian Kemp, and despite Jones entering the year as the overwhelming favorite to succeed the governor, at least on the Republican side. In the Senate runoff, Congressman Mike Collins defeated Derek Dooley, the former football coach personally recruited by Kemp to challenge Democratic Senator Jon Ossoff. The results upend assumptions that have guided Georgia politics for years. Trump's endorsement was not enough to save Burt Jones. Kemp's political machine was not enough to lift Derek Dooley. And Republican voters proved they were willing to defy both men in the same election. We're going to break down the winners, the losers, and what comes next. Starting with our team in Jackson. Patricia, Tia, you both were at events for Mike Collins and Burt Jones. Patricia, you first. You were Burt Jones. What was the mood like?
So the mood when the evening started was incredibly positive. I think the entire Jones team, including Jones himself, felt like the endorsement from Governor Kemp at the last minute gave him a big boost that he needed and that would be effective in getting him across the finish line. Then you started to see people around the room looking at their phones and sort of elbowing each other, like, hey, did you see this? Then it sort of turned to denial. Supporters came up and said it's not over yet. There's still plenty of votes to be counted. And that was after NBC News had already called the race. And then by the time the lieutenant governor came up to concede the race to Rick Jackson, I think people were truly shell-shocked. A piece of it was the amount of money that was spent in the race by Rick Jackson. I think another piece, and I'll put myself in this category, to see Burt Jones go down with such a powerful family behind him. We always thought of him as the big money in the governor's race. He had all the institutional support and then the governor's support, and then out of absolutely nowhere, here came Rick Jackson and took Burt Jones down, and it wasn't particularly close.
And Tia, he was the big money in the race. I mean, $26 million of his own family's money going to support his candidacy for governor. I mean, that used to be the big heavy until Rick Jackson came in and spent more than $100 million of his own cash to help him win this race. If you look at the early voting numbers, early voting overwhelmingly favored Rick Jackson, but Burt Jones thought he had enough election day voting support to get him across the finish line with Governor Kemp's surprise endorsement, and it was not enough.
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, Burt Jones had big money, but Rick Jackson had bigger money. And there wasn't a lot of daylight between them policy-wise. And I think some voters like Rick Jackson's personal story better. We know that especially Republican voters like a rags to riches story, emphasis on the riches. You know, part of the reason why Donald Trump became such a successful political figure is because part of his story is saying, you know, as a businessman, I've been successful and I'm got a lot of money, and, you know, that resonates. That's kind of the part of the American dream that Donald Trump sold to voters, and Rick Jackson sells even, you know, a true rags to riches story that creates this, you know, look at me, this successful billionaire. And so I think that really resonated with voters versus, you know, this perception that Burt Jones had a dad who was giving him money.
And we are
you hear the train out in Jackson.
The train in the background.
The Mike Collins Express here in Jackson, Georgia. So,
I love it. It's a midnight train in Georgia.
Yes,
I love
it is. It is. But yeah, you know, I mean, in some ways, I've always felt this from the beginning that, like, you know, Burt Jones, money, conservative MAGA bona fides, and was going to ride that to the nomination. And Rick Jackson came in and, like, took his plan and did it more, you know, more, just as conservative, but picking away at that, just as much money, but more.
And in a sense, the Rick Jackson message near the end was also, I'm not fighting over, I'm still going to be loyal to President Trump. I'm still going to be an ally to Governor Kemp, but I'm not fighting for them. I'm fighting for you. And that was something, Patricia, we heard really ring through. Jackson also, I wouldn't even say previewed his general election argument. He basically outlined it at his speech tonight, going after Democratic nominee Keisha Lance Bottoms. Let's take a listen.
Georgia cannot afford to get this wrong. We face Keisha Lance Bottoms, the former mayor of Atlanta. Keisha Lance Bottoms did such a bad job as mayor, she didn't even run for re-election. She would be an absolute disaster for Georgia. When violence surged, families were afraid, businesses worried, and police officers needed support. Keisha Lance Bottoms turned her back on all of them. Keisha Lance Bottoms failed. She hopes Georgians forget what happened when she was in charge. I won't let them.
So, Patricia, Rich Jackson is leaving no mystery what argument he's going to make to not just Republican voters, but also he mentioned middle-of-the-road voters, independent voters, even Democrats who aren't comfortable with Bottoms as the nominee. So he's going to be reaching out to them through this campaign, where, of course, MAGA loyalists are going to help him on the Republican side, but this is the campaign that'll be won or lost, essentially, by the voters in the middle.
Yeah, and when you mentioned that he'll be helped by MAGA loyalists, I have to tell you, the anger inside the room of Jones supporters tonight was palpable, incredibly livid at the amount of money that was spent by the Jackson campaign, the attacks that came against Jones and the Jackson campaign, and in particular, some members of the legislature who were there, who are Republicans and are conservatives, said, hey, Rick Jackson called us all a cabal and said that we were all bought and paid for. And so I think Jackson has some real work to do to mend those fences if he wants to. But the idea that all of MAGA will come and line up for Jackson immediately doesn't feel like that was the case in the room tonight among the Jones supporters, and that seems to be more widely felt among Jones voters around the state as well, who I talked to.
Yeah, it's interesting because at Rick Jackson's party up in Sandy Springs, it was full of House lawmakers. I don't think a single Republican senator endorsed him through the runoff, but it was full of House members who were just like, I was here first. We were one of the first people. There were some folks who took a big gamble on backing Rick Jackson very early in the campaign. Jan Jones was there. She's one of the senior Republican House members. And so they have a very different view of that, of those attack lines. Tia, let's shift over to the Senate race. You've been covering Mike Collins versus Derek Dooley. This was a race where the Trump endorsement wasn't as big of a surprise. The timing was the surprise. The endorsement wasn't exactly the huge surprise, but it was a gut punch to Derek Dooley, who was already looking like he was trailing in early voting and needed a big turnout, needed a lot of support from Metro Atlanta in particular. And when I saw those first big batches of votes come where Rick Jackson was up 60-40 over Burt Jones, but the same territory, Derek Dooley was neck and neck with Mike Collins. I just knew it was going to be a long, long night for Derek Dooley.
Yeah, at the end of the day, this runoff ended up being not as close, not as competitive as I thought it would be. The fact that the race was called by 9 p.m., it was a pretty early night for Mike Collins. And so you're right, those early returns, it immediately wasn't looking good for Derek Dooley. I think it's interesting because Mike Collins was always the more Trump-aligned candidate in the race, even without Trump's endorsement, which didn't come until, last weekend. But quite frankly, Mike Collins was always the front runner. He led in every kind of serious poll. Yes, Derek Dooley gained on him. Derek Dooley came from nowhere, essentially, and ended up in second place, but he never was able to wrestle the lead from Mike Collins. And I think Mike Collins, it's interesting because, yes, he's very MAGA. Yes, he's got baggage. He has controversies. His social media has gotten him in trouble and is going to, be an issue in the general election. But Mike Collins also, he had captains in every county. He campaigned around the state. He had 6 stops just on Monday, the final day of campaigning. And when he's in that room with voters, he connects in a way that I think a lot of people who just know him from social media or from afar don't really see. And I think that paid off for him as well.
Yeah, authenticity has never been his issue. Let's listen to his victory speech, at least a snippet of it, where he talks about uniting behind the Republican banner.
Now we stand united around one mission.
That's right. And y'all know what the mission is. Was to put a Republican in that seat and get rid of that Jon Ossoff in November. Return this seat to the people of Georgia.
Meanwhile, Patricia, Jon Ossoff comes out with a statement he's been sitting on for weeks, it felt like, just swinging hard at Mike Collins, really bringing up the same arguments that Derek Dooley brought up on the campaign trail. Let me read you a portion of it. Quote, Donald Trump's handpicked candidate, Mike Collins, is a notorious bigot, anti-Semite, and extremist, currently under federal investigation for the illegal misuse of tax dollars. So that gives you just an idea of where this general election campaign is going.
Yeah, and you had mentioned earlier the race that Rick Jackson was planning to run against Keisha Lance Bottoms. The fact that these 2 top-tier Republican contests went to runoffs has clearly given Democrats a big head start about what their plans are going to be as they're running against these Republican candidates. And as you said, Ossoff has had that talking point ready to go, and it is unbelievably aggressive. It does feel like, Georgia is such a battleground state. We've got 4 candidates here who are going to absolutely rip each other apart. I don't think there's any other way to say it. I think it feels existential for the Democratic Party to stop the Republicans in Washington and here in Georgia. The fact that Democrats could run the state at the top of the ticket is, I think, shocking and terrifying for Republicans. Although, again, I spoke with a number of Republicans in the Jones campaign, and this won't surprise anybody, although I was a little surprised these were his supporters who said, I think that Jackson's going to lose to Keisha Lance Bottoms. I think we're going to have a Democratic governor. We're going to have the first Black female governor. We'll go ahead and check that box, and then maybe Republicans can be in charge some other time. They do not have confidence that Jackson is going to be able to get through this race against Bottoms with the amount of incoming they feel like he's going to have now that he's passed this primary.
I will say this, 2 points I want to make. Let's give the Burt Jones supporters a couple of nights to sleep on it, because we know there's a lot of hard feelings, and maybe a couple of nights to get out of their feelings. They might not feel, they might be ready to hear Rick Jackson out. That being said, we know, just like we said, Keisha Lance Bottoms has some bridges to mend, so will Rick Jackson, and we'll see how he handles it. But my question, Greg and Patricia, is will we see Rick Jackson and Mike Collins share the stage anytime soon, the way that Ossoff and Bottoms immediately kind of teamed up? Of course, there's a different dynamic. Ossoff and Bottoms kind of feed off each other. There's a symbiosis there. Not the same dynamic, but it'll be interesting to see how they choose to proceed now that we know who the nominees are.
Yeah, that'll be interesting to see if there's a Republican unity ticket, which, as we've mentioned before, is not really the norm. What Ossoff and Bottoms are doing is very, very unconventional when you look at recent Georgia history. Let's take a quick break. When we come back, let's talk more about Governor Kemp's legacy, what the impact could be on the redistricting session, and we're going to go into some of the down ticket races. This is Politically Georgia from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. Welcome back to Politically Georgia. A reminder, if you've got a question you'd like to ask us here on Politically Georgia, you can call our hotline anytime, day or night, leave the question, and we'll play it back and answer it on our Monday mailbag. The number is 810-5297. You can also email us at politicallygeorgia@ajc.com. Producer Shaney B is standing by with his legion of interns. This was a double-decker defeat for Governor Brian Kemp. We've talked a lot about how his last-minute endorsement for Burt Jones really stunned Republicans. And that was one part of it. But Derek Dooley's the bigger part of it, because Derek Dooley, he didn't just endorse Derek Dooley. He helped build that campaign, Patricia, like from the ground up, recruited him, surrounded him with allies, helped clear the field for him. I mean, this was a Brian Kemp creation and really an argument about electability, that only someone like Derek Dooley, who's an outsider, can win in November, and voters in June soundly rejected that.
Yeah, I think we may have found Governor Kemp's blind spot in his very successful 2 terms as governor. His track record of picking Senate candidates and statewide candidates to get behind. When you look at Burt Jones, Derek Dooley, and Kelly Loeffler, all 3 of them have been big, not just big misses. Kemp has not been able to lend his popularity to them. It has not gotten them across the finish line. I think Derek Dooley was really the most audacious choice, because he had to stand up. He had to pick Derek Dooley, stand him up, take him around the state. When I went to events for Derek Dooley and talked to people like, oh, what brings you out to see Derek Dooley? Like, oh, well, I just wanted to come see the governor. You're like, okay, well, maybe you'll meet Derek Dooley while you're here. You know, it was very much a Kemp first operation, and he's an old friend of the governor's. And I've observed that Dooley did become a much better candidate than he started, but there was not the flavor that no Republican voters, it did not look like we're trying to order a Derek Dooley off the menu. It felt like it was Brian Kemp saying, hey, I know what's best, and this is it. The problem is that Republican voters did not agree.
Yeah, I mean, Tia, one of the arguments they were trying to make was vote not with your heart, but with your head, or vote with both at least, right? Electability. That you were at the campaign event with all 3 of us were there on Monday in Chamblee, where the governor and Derek Dooley both made the case that a vote for Mike Collins was a vote for Jon Ossoff, that electability should be the main issue, not policies. And, those are all important too, but electability was at the center of their argument.
Yeah, and I mean, maybe in November, if Jon Ossoff wins and defeats Mike Collins, maybe we'll hear Governor Kemp saying, I told you so, you picked the wrong candidate. But Brian Kemp is a politician who knows that electability doesn't necessarily drive Republican voters in our current political ecosystem. Loyalty to Donald Trump drives a lot of Republican voters, and then those who don't care as much about loyalty to Donald Trump want someone who's going to push a conservative agenda. And in this primary, Derek Dooley did not check either box as far as the evidence that voters had. He didn't have a political record or even like political activism. He hadn't even voted. So I think it was tough for him to convince voters that you can trust me to push a political agenda more than they trust Mike Collins, who they have seen, in action for the last 4 years. And then for those who want to see loyalty to Donald Trump, he didn't vote at all. He, tried to kind of bolster his relationship with Donald Trump, but Trump himself said, you seem like a nice guy, but I don't know you, and I can't say you're loyal to me. And so I think without being able to check either box, that made it tougher for Derek Dooley to win a Republican primary. I think Governor Kemp, in his heart of hearts, knows that, but I think this is a test and further proof that, again, electability alone, sometimes that works when you're a Democrat. We have Joe Biden, who got elected basically because people felt he would be the most electable candidate against Donald Trump in 2020. We don't see that much on the Republican side, though.
Yeah, it's a good point. And we did try to talk to Governor Kemp at the Dooley campaign party at the Battery, but he said he's not quite ready to talk about these dual defeats yet. Patricia, let's also talk about the special session. There's still going to be a special session on Wednesday, no matter what, to tackle changes to how Georgia counts its ballots. But it did feel like tonight was the nail in the coffin for any effort to push redistricting. We've been talking about this for the last week or so, about how there was mounting concerns among House lawmakers, House Republicans, also some Senate Republicans who just worried that redrawing the maps right now for 2028 would backfire, would mobilize Democrats, the worst possible time in the middle of a really volatile midterm election and right in the middle of the World Cup, all these issues, right? Well, the sentiment at Rick Jackson's party from the House lawmakers I talked to there, or the text I'm getting, the text I'm sure you guys are getting too, is essentially that there's very little appetite. We as of this taping, we still have not heard formally that redistricting pushes off, but I would not be shocked some point Wednesday to hear from House leaders, from legislative leaders saying redistricting is no longer on the calendar. And there's an ability to do that because Governor Kemp can't force them to vote on it. He can only summon them to a special session to lay the groundwork for redistricting. He cannot compel them to do so.
Yeah, and I think that it was very obvious from recent conversations that Lieutenant Governor Burt Jones' office had been the office that mainly had the appetite for redistricting between the two chambers. But now that the Lieutenant Governor has lost, he's not going to be the governor next year. It seems very plausible that the House might have the stronger argument here. What we're hearing from Republicans is they don't understand why now, why do this, why redistrict when for 2028, when we all know that it not only could energize Democrats, it has energized Democrats. At that first rally for Jon Ossoff and Keisha Lance Bottoms, the main theme was Republicans can't get elected, so they just want to pick their own voters so that they can continue to hold power here in Georgia. And they're going to do that through redistricting. And those were the biggest applause lines by far. It certainly would mobilize Democrats and will mobilize Democrats if they do it. And we'll see on Wednesday morning if that's a fight that they want to go into.
If they don't do redistricting in this special session, that does not mean they won't do it at all.
Yeah.
They might just wait until after the general election. They'll have the rest of November, the first half of December to do it. If Democrats win in November, we can expect a special session before those Democrats get sworn in, if there is no special session this week. So I just want our readers to know it could be delayed. It doesn't mean it's completely off the table.
Yeah. And look, there still will be a special session. It just might not tackle redistricting. But you're exactly right. And they could tack on other issues too in November, December, even the first week of January, as one lawmaker reminded me tonight. Before we get out of here, let's talk a little bit quickly about some of these down ticket races. We're going to be scouring through all these results for a long time to come. But the Republican race for Lieutenant Governor, State Senator Greg Dolezal upsets John F. Kennedy, the former Senate Republican leader. That was a stunning result for some people. He won despite controversial social media posts that sparked a lot of bipartisan backlash, including Islamophobic messaging. Josh McLaurin defeats former State Senator Nabila Parks in the Democratic race for Lieutenant Governor. McLaurin is State Senator from Sandy Springs, who had the endorsements of the trifecta, Senators Jon Ossoff, Raphael Warnock, and Stacey Abrams, the former gubernatorial nominee. And guys, I want to also mention the Secretary of State race. Penny Brown Reynolds beats Dana Barrett. She won the Democratic nomination for Secretary of State. And the other interesting one, State Representative Tim Fleming, he wins the Republican nomination for Secretary of State over Vernon Jones, someone all three of us have covered very intensely. Vernon Jones is a former Democratic CEO of DeKalb County who switched parties, became a MAGA loyalist, and he campaigned to saying that the 2020 presidential election was stolen from Donald Trump, loses this race pretty resoundingly to Tim Fleming.
Yeah, and Vernon Jones was at the UFC fight just last weekend on Trump's birthday, but we should note Trump did not endorse in that race. He's endorsed Vernon Jones before when he ran against Mike Collins, but he did not endorse Vernon Jones this time around.
And before we get out, one last one. John Cowan, the neurosurgeon from Rome, Georgia, who was the runner-up to Marjorie Taylor Greene. He wins the Republican nomination in Georgia's 11th district to succeed Barry Loudermilk. He defeats Barry Loudermilk's handpicked successor, his former top aide, Rob Adkerson, self-funded campaign. But it turns out, Patricia, that even some of his old social media posts that we documented really meticulously way back when, criticizing President Donald Trump, they did not come back to haunt him.
Yeah, that's right. And I think it's another example that as popular as somebody might be, it's very difficult to pick your own successor if the voters are not on the same page.
I see a trend. Well, that's going to do it for today's edition of Politically Georgia. If you found us on YouTube, welcome to our channel, and please click the subscribe button so you never miss an episode. You can also follow the Politically Georgia podcast on Apple, Spotify, or any podcast platform. Wherever you're listening, we always welcome your comments, ratings, and reviews. We'll talk to you next time on the Politically Georgia podcast from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution.
Thanks for listening to the Politically Georgia podcast. Our executive producer is Shane Backler. AJC's head of audio is Sam Stamler. Production support from our partners at Goat Rodeo, including Kara Schillen, Hazel Hoffman, and Max Johnston. For more of our political coverage, visit ajc.com/politicallygeorgia. And we invite you to support local journalism by subscribing to the AJC. Join us again next time on the Politically Georgia podcast from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution.